going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Now that Phase 4 of the MCU has come to a close, it's time to rank every Phase 4 project from worst to best. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your ranking of Marvel's Phase 4 is. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content on a near daily basis. Just a heads up as we get into this, in order for me to properly talk about why I rank certain projects where they are, this will get into spoiler territory. So if you still haven't seen every Phase 4 project of the MCU by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch all the movies and shows, then come back to this. But let's not waste any more time and let's jump right into it. In last place is The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Now, this could have been something really interesting and meaningful, especially as this came out while things were still shut down in the US and only some stuff was coming back, but everything was still up in the air. So there were some interesting parallels from real life to the characters in the MCU recovering from life after the blip, where characters are forcibly displaced from their homes and characters who were blipped can't pick up right where they left off. So this could have been really compelling stuff. And that's actually the plight of our villain here, and when we do get into some of that stuff, it can be captivating. It's just that for a good part of the 6-episode run, it's actually pretty dull. While I'm all for spending time with characters and giving them room to breathe, this just had no sense of urgency for the first few episodes, and it moves along at a pretty sluggish pace. It didn't feel clear what was the ultimate point driving this forward, and in turn it caused the antagonists, whenever we did see them, to especially feel thin and underwritten, leading to the conflict not feeling all that interesting. It doesn't really start coming together until the second half, more due to the John Walker plot point, but, and this is a common theme that runs through most of these Disney Plus shows, it then goes to wrap things up in a pretty abrupt way, with a finale that's meant to feel super inspirational, but didn't feel earned. While it was cool we did get that fun little meme of Zemo dancing, and that was a highlight of the series, this one just felt pretty underwhelming overall. Next we have Moon Knight, and while this one was okay, this might just be one of the biggest disappointments of the MCU for me so far, because I had some high expectations for this between Oscar Isaac and Ethan Hawke's involvement, the fact that 2 episodes would be directed by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, and the perceived/assumed more mature tone that we thought this was going to go for. And when we get to that first episode, it did seem like a breath of fresh air for the MCU, where we experience most of the events through our lead character's eyes, and he experiences these disorienting flashes that we don't know the source of. I thought this had the potential to have some really innovative storytelling, but that almost immediately comes apart starting in the second episode. While Oscar Isaac is great, and the idea of exploring these multiple personalities could have made for a dense, layered narrative, what ultimately happens is each episode begins to mostly feel repetitive, where they'll mostly be made up of these grating arguments between the Steven personality and the Mark personality that are meant to be kind of comical, but there's never really a joke in there. And they ultimately never go anywhere or add anything truly intriguing to the mythology, with the only thing changing is maybe the setting. And they'll throw out a lot of exposition at you and hit you with all these different names of all these gods, and it just didn't feel like it actually explored much of what it brought up, especially with it completely underutilizing its villain in Ethan Hawke, who gave a good performance, but just had weak material to work with. There were some sporadically intriguing moments of this series, but this was less than the sum of its parts for me. Number 15, Black Widow, the long-lost Phase 3 movie that we got in Phase 4, with it taking place after the events in Civil War, which we needed to do because by this point, the title character died in Endgame. Now this one's a bit frustrating in particular because Black Widow should have had her own movie for a while now. This was someone who fans have wanted to see get her own film, and the way her character was getting set up within the MCU, it hinted at there being so much to explore, since a big subplot in all the team-up movies she appears in is that her backstory is a bit of a mystery and she's trying to figure herself out. And we do explore all that here, as we do get to see her long-lost family. It's just, it feels too little too late. The emotional impact didn't feel quite as profound to me, and in some ways, it felt more because this is the first time in a bit, up until this particular point, where it felt more like Marvel just going through a bit of the motions. This is definitely one of those movies where it felt like Marvel was just relying on their usual bag of tricks, delivering the bare minimum on their formula without doing anything too new. It almost felt like them saying, hey, we got your movie, now can we move on? Now, because the Marvel formula does provide a lot of entertainment value, it does lead this to still being a good bit of fun at times. The family dynamic is a blast, and Florence Pugh in particular is by far the biggest standout as fan favorite Yelena. It can be beautifully shot, mainly in the first half, and it's clearly influenced by old school political espionage thrillers, and it can be pretty gripping at times when it leans into all that. But at the same time, you also have an extremely underwhelming villain here in Taskmaster, and the third act also sees a problem that pops up in a number of MCU projects where it's this flashy light show that's so heavy on CGI explosions that it masks how the big battle didn't really feel like one of the most creative points in the movie. As a whole, this is fine overall. I didn't dislike it. I just think that more could have been done for a character who was so integral to the MCU for so long. Number 14, What If, which sees the MCU's expansion into animation, and this easily as one of the best concepts of all these projects, as it allows for all these fun scenarios pairing up characters who normally don't get paired up, and it also allows for some good standalone adventures, because that's one thing you often hear about as a criticism with the MCU, where you have to now watch so many movies and Disney Plus shows in order to fully realize what's going on with whatever the newest project is. So with What If, while it did stem from events that we saw already in the MCU, that being the finale of Loki, most of the stories were self-contained, so you can just sit back and enjoy yourself for what the episode was. At least when it was good. And that's the big thing with this one. It definitely hits more than it misses for sure, but there was definitely a big case of inconsistency on display here. For one thing, the animation style could have been a lot better, and as good as the actual stories were, it was sometimes hard to get over the cell shade style of animation that felt like an unfinished product. Now, as for the stories themselves, you had some good, really inventive episodes here that would be a blast, like the Party Thor episode or the Avengers Murder Mystery episode, or they'd be so dark in their creativity, like the Doctor Strange episode. But while those were some great highs, there'd also be some fairly dull lows, where the episode is a bare-bones retelling of the original movie with only a few minor changes, with the one in particular really sticking out to me being the first episode with Captain Carter. Again, it just felt like a bit low effort. Now, the one thing that I thought was a pleasant surprise were the final two episodes, which were revealed to bring all these characters from the previous episodes together. I thought that was a nice way to bring the whole thing full circle in a way that doesn't come off as forced or anything. So I think it ended things on a strong note for its season. I just wish that the road getting there wasn't quite as bumpy. Number 13, Miss Marvel. Now, this is another one where I had a good enough time with it, but given the way it starts, I was a little disappointed that by the end, it didn't make it higher on this list. Because especially with this coming off the even more disappointing Moon Knight, I had such a great time with the introduction to Kamala Khan, with the first episode that's presented as a hyper-stylized version of a Disney Channel show, with all these unique visual cues, like text being displayed over a wall, or on the floor in a grand wide shot. Plus, there was so much charm to it, especially in the way it adds this extra layer of relatability to it, considering how Kamala is such a huge fan of the original Avengers and all the characters we previously saw in phases 1 through 3. So the show essentially explores the way that the MCU itself has become such a phenomenon and how it's brought so many people together through the interactions between Kamala and her friends, who had such a fun dynamic. Though while Iman Vellani's charm carries a lot of this through and it's still vibrant from a visual standpoint, unfortunately it just never quite reaches the same heights as that first episode. It can still be fun, don't get me wrong there, and I do like how it tries exploring this deeper mythology that ties into Kamala's family history, but I found it to be a bit tonally inconsistent at times, with a self-serious feel from time to time that also led to some sluggish pacing here and there. And what doesn't help either is that I also think, once again, the villain is pretty forgettable, feeling more akin to duller MCU villains that just have duplicate powers of the lead characters. Again, because of how great both our lead actor and the lead character is, it goes a long way, and it makes some of the issues more forgivable than some of the entries lower on this list. But it's still not as amazing as I hoped it would be, though I am very much looking forward to see where they take this character next. Number 12 is Loki, and this is one that a lot of people absolutely loved. I know Tom Hiddleston is one of the bigger fan favorites in the MCU as a whole, and he's great as always here. But while I enjoy this overall, again, I just didn't love it. I think like most of the Disney Plus shows, this suffers a bit from being only 6 episodes because it would lead to some bizarre pacing issues where one minute it would drag things out and then the next minute it was rushing things. And this was no exception to that, especially because when you get into the multiverse and you get into this whole backstory with the TVA and how they all come into play, it's a lot to cover. It's just that it's only 6 episodes. Though, actually, I do think this got a bit better as it went along. Outside of the moment of Loki seeing his fate in the main timeline in the first episode, I don't think this started off in the most emotionally resonant spot, but I think that it got there as things would move along. I especially thought the high point was the episode where Loki got to interact with all the variants of himself, with Richard E. Grant being a highlight of the entire show. Though I also did enjoy the final episode, which gave us the tease for our big bad, Kang the Conqueror. Jonathan Majors was awesome as the variant He Who Remains. I thought it was a pretty gripping finale, with it being this tension-filled conversation between him, Loki, and Sylvie, which sets up pretty much where the MCU as a whole is headed to with this multiverse saga. So it ends in a much better place than it began. I just wasn't always enamored with the journey getting there, but it was still good overall. Number 11, ShangChi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Another one where a lot of people absolutely loved it, and I just liked it overall. A lot of people were going on when this was first released how this was, hands down, one of the best MCU films, no questions asked. They were saying it a few times up until that point already, post-Endgame, but this time apparently it was supposedly for real. And, well, I will say I can see where that's coming from. With this taking a lot of inspiration from classic martial arts films, you do have some of the better fight choreography in the MCU in quite a bit. The fight on the bus that was so heavily advertised in the trailers was great, as was the fight on some scaffolding halfway through the film. Plus, you also have hands down one of the best villains in the MCU in recent memory, with Tony Leung absolutely crushing it as Wenwu. His backstory and his relationship with Shang-Chi was by far one of the most compelling things about the film, and we explore that quite nicely through most of this. And for a good 2/3 of the movie, I was on track to actually agree with everyone about this being one of the better MCU films. But then we got into that final act where they kill off Wenwu, they move away from the martial arts inspired action, and they instead go with the usual CGI spectacle that didn't feel quite as inspired as everything else, instead focusing on a giant kaiju battle that gets introduced so late in the game. Now, I didn't dislike the ending overall, but it definitely did bring the movie down for me a bit. I still liked it as a whole. I especially liked they used the movie to correct one of the biggest frustrations MCU fans had with the Mandarin, but this just isn't top tier MCU for me, unfortunately. Bringing us into the top 10, the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, which is just a fun, lighthearted, breezy little watch that aims to simply get us in the holiday spirit and put a smile on our face with this small-scale but heartwarming story. And it succeeded there. If you like what James Gunn has done with these characters thus far, I'd find it hard to believe you're not going to be on board with this. Now, it's definitely the most openly comedic of the Guardians-related projects. Not that the first two movies weren't, but this one, outside of the ending, mostly just goes all in on the laughs, especially relying on the dynamic between Drax and Mantis, who made for such a fun pairing and a nice change of pace from typically just being supporting characters in these movies. And I also loved how Kevin Bacon, playing himself here, was totally game for whatever was thrown his way. He knew exactly what kind of project he was in, and he went all in on it, with him getting a chance to even poke fun at himself a bit. Now, for the most part, I felt this was also on track to become real top-tier MCU for me, and it would have been had it tacked on like an extra 15 minutes or so. While I like the idea of exploring the TV special format, having these smaller scale one-off adventures, the fact that it's only 40 minutes or so does lead to some time constraints. It's one of those things where you're getting so immersed in the adventure and you're having so much fun, but then it kind of just abruptly cuts things off and wraps things up maybe a bit quicker than it should have. I liked where it ended. I just think that it needed a bit more time easing to that point. It's still very much worth the watch, though. Number 9, Werewolf by Night, the other Disney Plus TV special that serves as a throwback to the days of the classic Universal monster movies, taking place in the same time period as those films, shot in black and white, and replicating the same mood and overall aesthetic. And I had a lot of fun with this. Michael Giacchino steps behind the director's chair here in addition to scoring the special, and while he sets the atmosphere well with yet another excellent score, he really shows how keen of an eye he does have behind the camera as well. This is one project that really feels like it goes against the grain of what we come to expect with an MCU production. It feels very much like its own thing, and while its plot can be thin, with this battle for a valuable stone being essentially the entire story and not much else, it's still a lot of fun. And once again, this is another project where for a good 2/3, it stays on track to become one of the best MCU productions. And for a lot of people, this is one of the best MCU productions. But similar to the Guardian special, its rather short runtime does prevent it from ever attaining that point. I think this would have been much better served as a movie, as it really doesn't feel like we get to explore this world quite as in-depth as we should have, and it just lessens some of the emotional impact in some areas at times. Going hand in hand with that note about the plot plot being a bit thin. I still like the idea of Marvel doing these one-off specials. I just think this one in particular should have just been a movie, but it's still really solid overall. Number 8, Eternals. And with this so far being the only MCU production altogether that has a rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes, I gotta say, I really don't understand the hate behind it. I mean, I do understand some of the criticisms behind it. I think it would have been better off as a miniseries, mainly due to the fact that it introduces so many characters and it's telling their story over the course of so many years. But I will say, I think it actually succeeded in getting a lot of that across. I really don't think it's as messy in conveying that as everyone made it out to be. Though at the same time, yes, there are a few of the titular characters who do feel a bit tossed to the wayside, because even at 2.5 hours, it's just not quite enough time to cover everyone and everything. These are characters with such rich, deep backstories, and with there being so many of them, 2.5 hours is just not enough time. But I do think this succeeds at conveying emotionally compelling storylines for the characters who do get the spotlight, which is why I still really enjoy this overall. I especially like the way this touched upon themes about the morality of godly beings and if and how they should interfere with worldly matters, and while there was room to go even deeper than it did, I still think it got the point across really well. And if nothing else, this is just one of the most beautifully shot of all the MCU productions. The cinematography is gorgeous, and Chloe Zhao replicates the feel of her more grounded indie work like Nomadland that makes for a more immersive experience. Like I said, while I think this ultimately would have been better served as a Disney Plus miniseries from a narrative perspective, I think this actually stuck this landing much better than most people give it credit for. Number 7, WandaVision. The project to kick off Phase 4 starts things off in easily one of the weirdest, most unexpected places for the MCU that you could have thought, with a good part of the series paying homage to classic TV sitcoms from every era. The first few episodes in particular were really bold in the sense that it dropped us into this old 50s style sitcom, gave us no context as to how our characters wound up here, and just asked us to go with it, only dropping very small hints that there was something more afoot. And again, that resulted in what was mostly a very unique experience for the MCU. Now, once some of the mystery is revealed, it does lose a touch bit of steam, especially as it does shift a little back into your more typical MCU-isms, like the more generic CGI battles, but there's still a lot to appreciate here, from the returns of Jimmy Woo and Darcy, delving into the complex backstory of Wanda, all the classic TV homages that I mentioned earlier, though the big highlight for me is Catherine Hahn as our main villain, Agatha Harkness, who absolutely chews up the scenery, first in disguise as Wanda's nosy neighbor, and then going into full cackling witch mode once her true identity is revealed. And this just goes to show just how underappreciated of a talent she is. I mean, she's been a lot of fun in all of her previous roles, having been in plenty of notable projects, but this is one of the first times where she's truly out in the forefront and gets to shine, and all audiences can truly appreciate her talent. So I was really happy to see that. Plus, Agatha All Along is such a fun, catchy song. Number 6, She-Hulk Attorney at Law. And while this did come under some fire at first for its shoddy CGI, which, to be clear, is easily the weakest thing about this, once you get past that, this is honestly a blast if you ask me. It takes like a couple of episodes to find its footing, but once it got its groove, it's just a fun, somewhat low-stakes, self-aware superhero comedy that allows for crossovers with other characters who were previously known for much more serious outings. And here, they all just get to let loose. Like, we get the return of Charlie Cox's Daredevil, and unlike the feel of the grittier, much more mature Netflix show, here you get to see him cracking jokes and having these nice rapports with Jennifer Walters and some of the supporting characters while still being a badass in the action scenes. And you got that with several other characters who made recurring or one-off appearances here. And I don't think it's seen as compromising the characters or going against who they are. What's great about the comic book medium, and we see it replicated a number of times in Phase 4, is that you can experiment with characters a bit where they're involved in different types of stories that span multiple tones and genres, whether it be within their own titles or if they're portrayed one way in their own title and then maybe another way when we see them guest in another title. It allows for the feel of not being limited, and that's what I enjoyed about this. Now, if you're someone who's against the MCU being so jokey and you prefer your superhero stories to be somber, poignant, and extremely deep, you're not getting that here. This feels like arguably one of the most inconsequential of all the MCU productions. But really, not every superhero story needs to have the grandest of stakes or have these earth-shattering consequences. And because this just did such a great job at being so funny and charming, it's really not a big deal that this didn't hint at what's to come in the larger MCU. Number 5, Thor Love and Thunder, another of the more polarizing MCU projects. And the main thing is going to come down to if you like Taika Waititi's irreverent brand of humor, or if you hate it. Because while Thor Ragnarok was very much a showcase for Waititi's style, while still peppering in some of the usual MCU-isms, this goes even more in on the wacky hijinks and goofy antics. While the MCU generally does inject a lot of humor into all of its projects, this is one of the few movies where it goes into full-on superhero comedy territory. Now, it's not totally void of emotional depth. You do get some nice closure for Thor's romance with Jane, and it brings her storyline full circle, bringing her much more into the spotlight this time around, as opposed to the more thankless role she had in her earlier appearances. But for those who enjoyed the more Shakespearean elements of the early Thor movies, or like the tragic arc of Thor in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, unfortunately, you're going to be in for a bit of a disappointment here, as the comedic elements are what's most prevalent about this. Now, I mean, I can see why that would annoy some people, but I'm always down for comic book movies leaning into some of their more ridiculous elements. Plus, I am a fan of Waititi's sense of humor, so for me, I thought this was absolutely hilarious. If you don't like his brand of humor, I understand why you're not a fan, but gags like the screaming goats, for example, I really enjoyed. Now, as for Christian Bale's Gore the God Butcher, I will admit the film can be a little tonally imbalanced because he doesn't get quite as much screen time as I think we all would have liked, and considering how tragic his particular arc can be, it can be a little jarring when going from something like Thor's clothes being ripped off by Zeus to then Gore kidnapping children. But I will say, when we do circle back to his storyline, he's great. Easily one of the better MCU villains of Phase 4, and Bale is 110% committed to the role. I really just wish we got more of him, and the balance between his storyline and the rest of the movie is one of the weakest points. That being said, I still had a great time with this overall, and I don't think it's anywhere close to one of the weakest MCU projects. Number 4, Black Panther Wakanda Forever. By far the most challenging of all the projects to pull off, as Ryan Coogler was faced with a daunting task of continuing this franchise after the tragic death of Chadwick Boseman. But he pulled off what seemed like the impossible, with telling a gripping superhero movie that also manages to act as a moving tribute to the late actor, honoring Boseman's legacy beautifully. The opening scene in particular is a hell of a gut punch. It's also by far one of the most mature MCU projects. While it's not totally void of the usual quippy MCU-isms, they're definitely scaled back here so that its thematic elements and the performances of the cast can really shine through. Speaking of the cast, while Boseman's presence is sorely missed, everyone else here knocks it out of the park, with Letitia Wright in particular carrying much of the film wonderfully, though Angela Bassett gives such a powerful performance that I'd say it's definitely even Oscar-worthy. Now, all that being said, I do think this can feel a little overstuffed, and you do feel that nearly 3-hour runtime at times. Like, for example, there's a subplot centered on Martin Freeman and Julia Louis-Dreyfus that is essential for an early part of the movie, and then we keep revisiting them, but it just kind of feels aimless after a while, and throws off the pacing at times. But stuff like that aside, it's still an emotionally compelling, action-packed sequel that's one of the bright spots of Phase 4. Number 3, Hawkeye. And just when I thought after WandaVision that the rest of these Disney Plus shows were just going to be nothing but fine or underwhelming, here comes Hawkeye, and this was just such a delight. And it's so far the only one to successfully pull off the 6-episode format that's been so inconsistent through a lot of these other Disney Plus shows. I was hooked in immediately, and while it had a few minor ups and downs, it was pretty consistent the entire time, ending on just as strong of a note as it began. It was especially refreshing considering how Hawkeye's arc through most of his time in the MCU has felt mostly dour and tragic. So consider me pleasantly surprised when we got that trailer and it turned out to be a holiday-centered buddy comedy between Clint Barton and Kate Bishop. And as soon as they meet, the show leans into their dynamic hard, and it's an integral part of the series' charm, with Jeremy Renner and Haley Steinfeld's chemistry being nothing short of delightful and hilarious. And then add to that, bringing back Elena Belova to flesh out her storyline from Black Widow more, while also acting as a minor antagonist to Hawkeye. That was a nice addition halfway through, as was bringing back everyone's favorite Daredevil villain, Vincent D'Onofrio as Kingpin. Now, unfortunately, he didn't get quite as much to do here as he does in Daredevil, which I was a little disappointed with, but it didn't bring the series down for me. It was a welcome return, and I still enjoyed this overall. Our runner-up is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and I know this is another one that did get some flack for its CGI, which, yes, is a little shoddy here and there. And while I concede that this might not always be one of the most well-made MCU movies from a visual effects perspective, perspective, I still had an absolute blast with it. And the main reason for that is the fact that Sam Raimi is behind the camera for this. While the film starts off like your typical MCU production with maybe just a sprinkle of Raimi's influence, once we get the reveal that Wanda is our villain and the chase throughout the multiverse begins, this goes into full Sam Raimi horror movie territory, and his distinct style is so apparent all throughout this. We get clever jump scares, striking visuals, and his campy sense of dark humor that made for so many memorable moments. Like the sequence involving the mirrors early on, the music note sequence, and the inclusion of Zombie Strange were all just fantastic, among many other things. Plus, you have Danny Elfman's score that goes hand in hand with Raimi's fun little camera tricks, which would make some scenes that could have just been dull exposition dumps or standard fight scenes, and they made them feel so much more unique. Can the movie as a whole maybe feel a little rushed at times? Yeah. Can it be one of the more egregious examples of having to follow other MCU projects not related to the title franchise in order to watch it? Yes. Is it still a great time though? 100%. But in first place is SpiderMan No Way Home, essentially the Avengers Endgame of Spider-Man movies, with it bringing back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, as well as just about all their villains from each of their times playing the character. And while this is more or less a prime example of a movie that relies heavily on your nostalgia and calling back to all those classic Spider-Man moments that you know and love, it's just so well done in its execution. None of the characters here feel like cameos for the sake of having a cameo, which is something you're starting to hear as part of the MCU discourse a lot more these days. People just wanting the MCU movies stuffed with cameos from legacy Marvel actors or MCU actors who have moved on from their roles. But that's not what this is. In fact, none of the returning Spider-Men nor their villains are cameos. They're all an integral, continuously active part of the story, with the relationship that was more heavily advertised, that being between Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, actually being the smaller part of the film. And what's great is their presence allows for the movie to essentially recontextualize the entirety of Tom Holland's time in the MCU. Because yeah, for his first two solo movies and his appearance in the Avengers movies, he felt more just like Iron Man Jr., as a lot of people would call him. He wasn't the street-level hero that everyone found so relatable, but instead, he lived in Tony Stark's shadow and had access to all these cool gadgets, so he never had to experience the pains that made Spider-Man who he is. But here, between what he goes through with Aunt May and the advice he gets from the other two Spider-Men and what he realizes he has to do by the end of the movie, this essentially gives us the Spider-Man origin story without it being your typical origin story. And it feels emotionally compelling, with stakes and with dramatic beats feeling earned. This is by far the best Tom Holland's been as Peter Parker, and I really look forward to seeing where they take things next with his character after this. And as for the legacy characters, it was nice seeing everyone. It was a real crowd-pleasing moment getting to see all three Spider-Men in action. It's something I never thought we'd actually see, and it was so amazingly done. But for me, Willem Dafoe is the standout of everyone here. He's always been my favorite of the Spider-Man villains, and this even adds an extra layer of tragedy to his arc. And even though he started out not as an MCU villain, because of just how menacing he was here and because of the psychological effects he has on Peter here, this technically makes him one of the best villains we've seen in the MCU. So I had a great time seeing this all play out. It's nostalgia done right, it's an exciting, crowd-pleasing story, it's the best of all the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, and it comes in as my number one MCU Phase 4 movie. But let me know what's your ranking of Phase 4. Did you agree with this list at all? Did you disagree with it? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.